Hi, I'm the Moonlit Page Turner, and we have reached September. This year is flying by, which means it is time for my third quarter reads. Now, these are all the books that I read in July, August, and September. Just like in the previous videos, I'm going to separate them into book club reads. Then I have some nonfiction and fiction. So I do read a variety of books. I like different subjects. So I have, I think, 22 books to talk about today. And I read it on different platforms. So I do audiobooks, I have physical books, and then I do some on my e-reader. And I get most of my books from the library. I do love the Libby app. So you'll see some physical copies of books, and then you'll see pictures of books as I talk about them. For my book club reads, I'm in two book clubs. I have my Read the World series here on YouTube, and I'm also in the Savvy Gaming Network's video game book club, and I will link the videos below. For the Savvy Gaming Network, we read Eco Castle in the Mist by Mayuki Mayabe, and that is a novelized version of the game. It goes a little bit deeper into the story of the game. I gave this one 3 stars. It would have been a 4-star read, but there was a chapter in there that kind of took us out of the reading. It is a little bit dark because it does have to deal with children sacrifice, if you're familiar with the game. But Mayuki Mayabe goes and she kind of has the ability to create her own story from the story that was in the game. So everything that's in the game happens in the novel, but then it goes above and beyond. Our next book we got on e-reader because it's only available through ebooks, and this is Watchdogs in Dark Clouds, and this is by John Shirley. This is our third John Shirley read for the book club, and it's not great. So far, BioShock is the only John Shirley book that we liked. I felt like this book was a military drama that John Shirley wanted to write, and then they were like, "Oh yeah, and you're writing for Watchdogs." So he kind of threw what he wanted to write into the world of Watchdogs. Our main character is Mick Wolf. Aiden Pierce is the main character of the first Watchdog game, is in the book, but he's got a concussion, and so he can't do a lot of stuff, and he's kind of in and out. And we're in the world of Chicago. Um, it was good when it came to description, and there's a lot of things that happen, and it moves at a pretty fast pace, but I just did not feel like it fit into the world of Watch Dogs. I felt like he was writing a different story and then had to mold it into Watch Dogs world. So I only gave this one a 2. Um, John Shirley, we may not revisit you. The last book for the Savvy Gaming Network that we read was a graphic novel. It's actually 4 comics in one, and that is Dragon Age The Missing, and that is by George Mann. I only have one experience with Dragon Age. I played Dragon Age Origins, so I was really lost. It's the prequel to Vanguard, which is coming out in October, and so I didn't know who some of the characters were, and I was missing some of the plot. But I thought the artwork was beautiful. It was multiple artists. I think it's 4 different artists that are on there, and they meshed very well. But I just didn't kind of know what was going on because I hadn't played some of the other games. So for that one, I only gave it a 3. For the Read the World series of books that I do here on YouTube, I read books from Belize, I read books from Benin, and I read books from Bhutan. So from Bhutan, I read the folk tales, and this is by Kunzing Chowden. And I really like reading folk tales from other cultures because it lets you know what is important to those cultures, what kind of social structures that they have, as well as like are manners important. In the case of the folk tales from Bhutan, there was a big thing about wealth disparity where you have the rich people who are super rude and bad things happen to them, and then the poor people who are nice and kind and they just kind of go with the flow, and then good things happen to them. And that was in a lot of the stories. So that kind of shows me that this whole wealth disparity is an important part of the Bhutan culture. There's a lot of folk tales that deal with animals as well. Like there was a story of a girl who um, went into a mouse hole and she spent the night and was really kind to the mouse. She was poor, so she was like, "I'm poor. I'll sleep on straw." And then she was slept in a nice bed, and so she the next day left and had jewels in her hair. And so a rich girl was like, "I want jewels," so she did the same thing, but she was kind of rude, and she ended up with stung in her hair. So it's kind of like stories like that, and then there are like monsters in their stories. So a lot of kids being kidnapped, which I did also see in the Bahama stories. I really like reading the forwards because it talks about the ritual of folk tales. And just like the Bahamas, there is this interaction between the person telling the story and the person listening. So for them, there is this call and response at the beginning. Dingo Dangbo, I think is what it is. And then the response from the person that's listening is so that spirits don't steal the stories, the folk tales. It also talked about the similarities of the German folk tales and the Bhutan, which I found interesting because they're next to each other. So there has to be some cultural influence in there. Bhutan didn't really become a wide world culture. They were kind of closed off for a really long time. So it's more recent that we see the influence, which folktales have been around for a long time. So that's kind of stuff that I find interesting reading folktales. For Benin, I read Autobiography of the Lower East Side, and this is fiction. I really liked this book. I found it really interesting because our author, who is Rashida Ishmaeli, each chapter is a different character. All the characters interact with each other. So you get in the Lower East Side, so in New York in the 1950s, you get a variety of characters that live kind of in the same area and interact. A lot of the characters are Black. Either they're from Africa, like our first character, or they're from the South and they come to New York for their dreams. And then we have the Muslim religion is in here as well as Judaism. We have like a Hispanic character. So there is a wide variety of characters, both male and female, and they interact with each other because they show up in each other's chapters. So I really, really enjoyed this book. Then for Belize, I read fiction and nonfiction. So for fiction, I read Beka Lamb, and this is by Z. Edgel. And this is Beka Lamb is our main character. She's about 14, and this is like a coming of age story where Becca she fails her freshman year of high school, and she her main struggle is that she is a liar, and she knows this, and her family knows this. So she's really, really trying to be a good person and work on herself. There's a lot of things that happen around her, like her best friend, who is 17, becomes pregnant, and her life totally changes. And this actually affects Becca. We find out what happens to that friend at the beginning of the story. So it's like a retrospective story where we find out in that first chapter all of these bad things that happen, and then we go back. I did cry at the end of the story. I really liked it. It also talked about the governmental influence. This is where Belize was deciding whether or not to stay with England. They're the last English colony to survive, or to kind of side with Guatemala and become a little bit more independent, or become part of like Guatemala politics. So there is a political background here. It is a coming of age story. There is tragedy in it. I definitely cried at the end, but it was a great story. And Becca was a great character. For my nonfiction for Belize, I cheated because my author is not from Belize. So Rosita Arvigo is the author. The reason why I chose this book, and this is Satsun, is because it is about this man right here. And he passed away a couple years after this book came out. He's a Mayan medicine man, and he has great social influence as well as historical influence in the area. And so Rosita, she is into natural healing, and she's actually a doctor that uses naturopathy in her practice. And she's originally from Chicago, so she's American, but she lives in Belize part-time. And she talks about the history of healing, and Saskatoon has to do with it's an item that the Mayan gods bless as a way of divination, and she gets her own Saskatoon as she's learning from Don Elio. So I really enjoyed this book. Each chapter started with talking about a different plant, and then that plant was incorporated within the chapter. It does talk about her family struggle living in Belize, but it is mainly about Don Elio. So All in all, I had a great reads. The Bhutan folktales are a little weird, but I enjoyed everything that I have read so far for my Read the World series. My nonfiction reads, they're a little different. There's no common theme really for my nonfiction reads. I kind of read things as they became available. A lot of them were on my TBR list a while. So some of them I was really interested in reading like a decade ago, and some of them popped up a little bit more recently. So I read a lot of historical nonfiction. For example, the first one I'm going to talk about is The Worst Hard Time, and this is by Timothy Egan. And this is about the Dust Bowl. So, the Dust Bowl is a period in United States history that happened to correspond with the Great Depression. So, not only did we have an economic depression, but then the middle of our country, which was known for our farmlands, fell apart and literally turned to dust. And then when we're talking about a dust bowl or dust storm, we're talking about several feet high, like 30, 40 feet high. It was covering houses, the soil was depleted, and it was a horrendous time in US history. So not only were the banks failing and people couldn't afford their farms, but they couldn't actually live off their farms either because of the conditions. And so Egan spends a he talks about it in multiple years from the beginning kind of to the end when FDR steps in. But we look at maybe five main families and we follow them throughout. It's really well written, it's really well researched. The Dust Bowl is something that we talk about briefly in United States history and our education system. It's something that I think we don't talk enough about. You have Grapes of Wrath, which talks about it, and Kristen Hanna's The Four Winds is also about the Dust Bowl as well, but learning about it from a historical standpoint for nonfiction, The Worst Hard Time, it's super sad and very depressing, but it was a really well written book. On the same sort of depressing, I also finished Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. And this has to do with the US government and the Native Americans and how the US government broke pretty much every treaty we have ever made with the Native Americans. And in Dee's Brown's book, he spends most of the time talking about the period of time during and right after the Civil War. So we have the North that's fighting the South to free the slaves, but at the same time, they're fighting the Native Americans for property disputes as well as disputes on both sides for um, for murder and other awful things. Again, both sides. So the white settlers attacking the Native Americans attacking the white settlers, and it pretty much goes the same every chapter where you Brown spends time talking about a specific tribe and then how that tribe pretty much gets screwed over and their leaders end up either dead or on a reservation if they survive. A lot of people on the reservations did not survive because they were not great places to settle in the first place, which that why that land was available to them. So this is something that's been on my TBR list for quite a while. This is also a book that I feel like should be required reading in the United States. We do talk about Native Americans, but not as much as we should, and they definitely deserve a bigger spot in teachings of the United States history. The next book is a book that was also on my TBR list for quite a while, and I really wish that it stayed on that because I hated it. And that was The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. I actually listened to a podcast about it before it came available, and I was not that enthusiastic about reading it. It started off really good because Friedman spends time talking about the history of technology and, in particular, the internet and how the internet has opened up business and made the world flat, hence The World is Flat title. But then he starts talking about outsourcing and how we should be outsourcing and the benefits of outsourcing. He does not talk as much about the other effects of outsourcing, like what it does to the other countries' communities, as well as our own. And then, because this was the revised edition, he just starts ranting about a whole bunch of other things. So I wish that it would have just been the first part where it was the history of technology. Thought that was really interesting. And then it just got worse and worse and worse. So I do not recommend it. It was a 1 star. I almost DNF'd it 4 times, and I wish that I would have. Another book that's been on my TBR list for a while, and I loved it, and I should have read it earlier, is Stiff by Mary Roach. And Stiff is about cadavers, and in particular, cadavers that are donated for scientific purposes. So you can donate your body for science, and she talks about what happens when you do that, the how it's used and what we learned from it. And she does go into the fact that she herself is going to donate her body when she dies and how important that is. I did not realize that this book was going to be funny. I laughed probably more than I should for a book about death, and I learned a lot about it. So, Stiff is on a lot of people's recommended list. I gave it a 4. It was probably a 4.5 out of 5 for me, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that I read it. So Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, I said should be required reading. I think also my next book, which is It's Not Hysteria by Karen Tang, should also be required reading for any person with a uterus. Because again, in the United States, our sex education, not great. And there's a lot of things that we don't learn about our own body. And really, not just anyone with a uterus, but anyone who interacts with anyone with a uterus. Because this book is talks about the hysteria, which was kind of a women's condition. The word hysteria comes from ancient Greece, and it has to do with the wandering uterus, which is later on in the 1800s, where women were acting crazy but not. They were told that they were hysteric or hysterical, and that's where that term comes from. And she talks about that at the very beginning of the book, but then it goes into all the different things that happen with someone with a uterus, as well as treatment, and how to approach your first gynecological visit. So it was very informative. It's really well written. It's very easily approachable subject. So especially if you are a younger woman who is not really knowledgeable in that area, I highly, highly recommend this. And that leads me to my next couple books, which are all about women. The next book I got as a recommendation from like the World Travelers. They do each month for them is a different country. And I saw Woman Captain Rebel, and that's by Margaret Wilson. And that is about Thurdir, who is a Icelandic sea captain in the turn of the 1800s. And for her, she struggled in life. She lived a long life, and we hear about everything in her life. It was really, really well researched. However, it is not simply about her. I think if it was simply about her, the book would have been about half the length that it was. We hear about everyone in her life. And the thing that I took most away from this book is that Icelandic life is hard and difficult, and it has been for a long time. She spends time talking about there's not that many women sea captains, and after third year like retires, there's even less. Which she Wilson doesn't go in the fact that the Norse or the Vikings they're the ones that settled into Iceland, and they have a history of women sea captains. So it has become, I guess, less and less common as time has gone on that women have these roles of leadership and strength within the community. And being a sea captain can actually earn you quite a bit of money. And it was interesting with the social structure of the fact that you fish in the winter, but you farm in the summer. And to have a farm, you have to have property. And then that's also the only way that you can get married. So people can't get married until they have the property, but there's only a limited property. So those were the things that I found really interesting in the book. I think overall it was not that interesting to me. But Wilson definitely has a love for third year. She spends a lot of time researching, and you learn a lot, a lot, a lot. It was a little bit too much for me. The next book is Becoming Free Indeed, and this is Ginger Duggar Vulio, I think is how you say her last name. This is the second Duggar book that I've read. I read Counting the Cost, which was Ginger's sister. And so I kind of wanted to see a different perspective. And if you're looking for Ginger's perspective on her time on reality television, you're not going to really get it with this book. From what I felt like this book was penance for her last book. She wrote a book when she was younger with her sisters about life in the church. Ginger still has her faith, but she has totally switched from the teachings of Gothard, which is what she grew up with. And if you saw Shiny Happy People, the documentary that I think is on Amazon, it talks a lot about the Duggars and their faith and Goddard, who's not even in charge of that church anymore, and kind of the damage that he's done. And she talks about that as well. So this book is more about how she kept her faith and struggled in that time period. She does not talk a lot about her time on the show, but she does talk about the time that her journal was stolen from her room about because they would have people just show up at their house and they would give them tours. And this girl came and stole her diary and tried to sell it on eBay, which is a very huge violation, especially for a young girl keeping a journal. And so um, I felt like Counting the Cost was a better written book, and a little bit more interesting with the retrospective of her life. But I think if you're someone who is leaving a specific religion and you're looking to how to transition, I think that this book may be helpful to you. And the last book for nonfiction I read was Grimoire Girl, and this is Creating an Inheritance of Magic and Mischief, and this is by Hilary Burton Morgan. This is the second book that Hilary Burton Morgan has written. The first book, which is The Rural Diaries, I loved. I thought that book was fantastic. I've even gifted that book. This book is a lot different. Hilary Burton Morgan, she does like a lot of witchy things. And so she took some kind of generic witchy concepts and she talks about her like Appalachian magical past of the kind of magic that's passed down from like mother to son, and tries to incorporate the into some of her personal stories. Each chapter talks about kind of a different aspect, and then you get little informational things at the end, like this is talismans and how talismans can be important. She has chapters like on storytelling and creating your own grimoire, and um, so this one I was not as impressed with. I mean, I love her. I think she's funny. There's a lot of exclamation marks in here, as well as curse words. But if you know her, then that is her. And there was also a thing where she was talking about Dante's Inferno, and I found some of the information not to be correct. So um, I would say if you want to dive into Hillary's life, I would definitely recommend The Rural Diaries. I thought that was a really well written book and really emotional. This one was not so great for me. Okay, diving into the fiction books. It is getting into that witchy season, and I am the Moonlit Page Turner, so you know I have some witchy books. Apart from Hilary Burton Morgan's book, I've read a couple of witchy books. I'm planning on reading more for October. But I'm going to start with talking about The Witch of the Wild Things, and that is by Raquel Vasquez Gill. That one I struggled with at the beginning, and then it got a little better. It's a story about a magical family of sisters. Each sister has a different ability. One has plant magic, one controls the weather, and then the third sister, who I guess dies or was missing, 'cause they never found her when they were younger. She has a deal with animals, but she's haunting one of her sisters, and her sister has to come back home, and she runs into like her high school crush. So it was kind of some of it was like really serious, like that talks about domestic violence, and then some of it was just like, oh, I have a crush on him and he's so cute. Again, I struggled. I think I got through that one because I was reading this book at the same time. This is The Unfortunate Side Effects of Heartbreak and Magic, and this is by Brianne Randall. And this was marketed as, if you like practical magic and Gilmore Girls, you'll love this book. I DNF'd this book about halfway through because I couldn't do it. But I was reading this at the same time as The Witch of the Wild Things, and I felt like this book was so good that made The Witch of the Wild Things better. So I may revisit this. I'm halfway through. I did buy it, which I don't usually like to DNF books that I buy it, but also there's so much more to read out there that for me it was not worth my time. Still on the same witchy realm, I also read The Night of the Witch, and this is by Sarah Raish and Beth Revis. And this is a story about a witch and a witch hunter, and they like each other. And that's something that happens pretty early in the story. You have the main characters are Fritzy and Otto. Fritzy is the witch, and Otto's the witch hunter. And it goes every other chapter is the different characters. To me, this felt like two stories in one. So it makes sense that there are two authors because I really felt like the beginning and the end of the book were more equal than in the middle of the book. It went in a totally other direction. And I was also super irritated by Fritzy. She's a very powerful witch and she freezes in every aspect. She's like, oh no, I can't do this. Everything's so hard for the entire book. The entire book. Like she does not grow as a character, and that really irritates me. Fine, you have your female characters that struggle at the beginning, have them grow to become stronger at the end. But she kept freezing and she kept having, and it's supposed to create tension, but it just really creates irritation for me, at least. Again, these are my opinions. If you love that book, um, we come with different experiences into different books, and so I'm sorry if we don't agree, but that is my opinion. On kind of the same realm, I did read Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Now, I read this book before the controversy with Neil Gaiman came out. I do not excuse bad behavior, so I have put the kibosh on Neil Gaiman. I felt like though, because I've read Gaiman and Pratchett before, I felt like this book was very much Terry Pratchett, and that Neil Gaiman was probably put in there to kind of steer him in a direction because the humor is very Terry Pratchett. It is very similar to the television show. If you watched it on Amazon Prime, there are a couple of things that were different, and there was the scene with the bikers. That was my favorite part in it. It's very tongue in cheek. Again, very Terry Pratchett. If you've read his books. So I did enjoy it, especially the Terry Pratchett part of it. But again, I will say it. I do not excuse bad behavior. Speaking of bad behavior, I also read The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This is like the number one advertised book for um, book of the month. I still see the commercials today, so I picked it up, and I've never read Ali Hazelwood, so this is my first and probably last. The story is about a grad student who fake dates her professor or somebody else who's she's not really his grad student, and then of course they fall in love, and um, I thought the relationship was inappropriate even for a adult level. That he's a professor and she is a grad student, and she's sitting on his lap at a lecture, and that doesn't happen in college, at least at the colleges that I attended. So I was not impressed by this book. I like the fact that she writes about women in STEM. I think that is a good approach to take. But I don't always read romance. I don't usually like to read romance, but this one I was not a fan of. And on that road, I also read The Duke and I by Julia Quinn, which is the first of the Bridgerton books. I liked that book better than Love Hypothesis. I have watched the Bridgerton shows, and so I wanted to kind of check out the books to see how similar they were to the show. If you are a big fan of the show, you might like the books because it goes deeper into the relationships, and there are different things that happen, although there is no Queen Charlotte. And she is such to me, she's an important comedic part of the show, and you are missing a lot of the interactions of the different characters. So it's very focused on Daphne and the Duke's relationship, and a lot of the other characters are barely like Louise, I think, is mentioned twice. You get Penelope again; she shows up twice, but she doesn't really have any dialogue. I think she says one thing, and then that's pretty much the book. I thought as a romance it was okay, but again, I'm not a huge romance reader, so I did like it better than the Love Hypothesis though. The next couple books, same author. I read Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. I was waiting to hold off on this book for season 3 of the Shadow and Bone series, but that is no longer happening. So I was like, I'm just gonna have to read the books. I've read the Six of Crows books, and I think those are better than the Shadow and Bones. I was pleasantly surprised that the Siege and Storm was better than Shadow and Bones. I think Leigh Bardugo gets better as she writes. So at the beginning of the book, I was just like, oh, it's okay, and then it gets better as she goes. And I think the same thing for the Ninth House, and that I also read that book. That is her first foray into adult literature, and the Ninth House is about the secret societies that are in Yale, which Leigh Bardugo at the end, she always has the question and answer. She talks about that she was in one of them. And for the Ninth House, it does have a, speaking of the witchy books, it does have a magical component to it. There is sacrifices and um, I would say though, if you are a younger reader or if you are a more sensitive reader, just know that the Ninth House deals with essay and drug use. And so just take care while reading it. It's very, very different than her young adult books. So that is the warning that I will put out there. Again, I think it gets better the more that she writes, but it was really dark and it does talk about like death and all of that. You get what's happening in the story like not fully concrete until the end, although you can kind of put the pieces together as you go, so you get little snippets of the story and it's in multiple like timelines where you don't know what's present and what's past. So um yeah, I thought it was an interesting. I don't know if I'm going to continue that series, but I'm glad that I read the first one because I think it was an interesting approach from her to see her kind of grow and evolve as a writer. To me, it was really interesting. The last book that I'm going to talk about, which was very different than all the others, and it is a book that has been on my TBR list for quite a while, and that is Moloka'i, and that is by Alan Brennert. And Alan Brennert writes about the leper colony in Hawaii, which is Moloka'i, and we get kind of a full character's life again. This has been on my TBR list for probably over 10 years. Alan Brenner actually was writing for a documentary, and the documentary didn't go anywhere. So he's like, I'm gonna write a book instead. And we get Rachel. Rachel's our main character, and she gets diagnosed with leprosy when she's 6. And so she gets taken from her family, and she gets brought to the leper. She lives in Hawaii, into the leper colony, and then we see her for the rest of her life and all of the things that she goes through. She has really horrible things happen to her besides being taken from her family at the age of 6 and then also having leprosy. I didn't know that much about leprosy. I kind of, you know what the word leper is, and you have a like a picture in your mind of what a leper may look like. But the fact that leprosy is totally treatable nowadays, I think is something that a lot of people don't really, we don't really talk about leprosy anymore. It does happen in other countries where people are still getting leprosy, but they do talk about towards the end, kind of the medical background of that. And then, of course, as Rachel is able to leave Molokai, she faces discrimination. And then we also get information about Japanese internment is also in here. And just because of the fact that there is a Japanese American who then goes through internment in California. So I thought it's a really well written book. I think if I would have read it 10 years ago, I would have rated it higher. I've read other books that I feel like are more better written. It's just kind of the style of the book from the time period that it was written that I don't know if I just don't have patience for reading an entire book about someone's life that is just constant tragedy after tragedy. Like I need some wins. I need some good times. And so I'm glad that I read it. It's finally off my TBR list. I'm whittling it down as I'm adding more to it. But so those are all the books that I have read in July, August, and September. And I will see you in December for our end of the year wrap up and my fourth quarter reads.